Hello and welcome to the Law Deals podcast, where we discuss law firm succession plans, profitable law partnerships, and law firm purchases and sales. I'm your host, Ed Alexander. I've practiced transactional business law for 30 years, have my own practice, Alexander Business Law, and I'm a principal with Fitzgibbon Alexander, a business intermediary firm. We're on a mission to make sales of law firms commonplace so you can enjoy your practice and your life. Hello, and welcome to the Law Deals podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about the conversation. One huge hurdle of a successful exit is the transition of conversation with the associate. Now, remember, we're talking here about an internal sale transaction. So someone or a group within your firm will be buying the stock of the firm from you and ultimately taking the firm over. This is obviously an essential conversation because it's the time where you get buy-in or you get a rejection of the transaction. You know, in some instances, if handled really badly, it really could mean that the valuable team member is leaving. And I've seen this happen in a couple of instances. We'll talk about this in a few minutes. The first thing to remember about this conversation is that the seller mindset, your mindset, is absolutely essential. I just want to relay a little bit of a story here. I, several months back, spoke with a potential seller. And during the course of that conversation, I always ask, what is it that you'd like out of the firm? So she had a pretty detailed list of what she wanted out of the firm. First, she wanted her current salary post-closing. Now, her salary was actually above market because, ultimately she was taking out of the firm what she wanted to take out of the firm. So she paid herself above market. And her rationale was for the buyer to pay her this was because she would have to train the buyer's team on how to handle her cases. So in addition to her above market salary, she wanted a bonus for each of the cases that she had transferred to the buyer that hadn't resolved by the closing. And when those cases were resolved, she wanted a bonus based on those. Now, it's important to remember that in any transaction, you get paid for the work that you did, but you certainly wouldn't get paid for the work that you hadn't done. And also, simultaneously, if you're selling a case to the firm is already paying for the origination work that you did for that case. Next, she wanted the value of the computers, desks, furnitures, and other equipment that was in the firm. And then she wanted the price for her practice. Now, here's a problem. The problem is that the practice is based on the cash flow, right? And I've said this in previous episodes, that the value of your firm is the cash flow or function of the cash flow, together with the likelihood of that cash flow continuing into the future. And so if you remove all of the cash flow out of the practice, or a substantial amount of the cash flow, then obviously the value of that practice is going to be low. So the problem with this is that she was looking to receive all of the benefit out of the firm even after she sold the firm. The mindset here is the problem. If you're selling your firm and you are leaving the practice of law, then at the end of the day, you get paid for the value of your firm. The analogy that I give here is trying to sell your car, but wanting the ability to go and use it anytime you want. It doesn't work that way. So when you're talking with an associate for an internal sale, realize that at the end of the day, what you're talking about is giving up some benefits here, right? So you might have all of the income paid out through discretionary expenses. For example, travel, an automobile, meals, things of that nature, so that the income of the firm looks like it's zero. But when we add back these benefits for you, there's a value there because the firm can create cash flow or does create cash flow. And you, the owner, just decide to apply it to a particular thing. When you bring on an owner, a new owner, an associate to come in and take over the practice, or at least become your partner, you can't continue to take all of that out of the practice. Now, there's a way we can address this because we can grow the practice and we can set up criteria to grow the practice so that ultimately when we give a 10 or 20% interest to an associate, and I use the word give, but that's actually the wrong word, when we sell a 10% or 20% interest to an associate, that growth is ultimately going to bring you back to the point you were before you sold that interest to the associate in terms of the value of your interest in the firm. That's the first thing to keep in mind, and really a key thing. I see it so often. The next is that you've got to remember that your practice isn't perfect, right? And so you're not doing the buyer a favor, the associate, a favor by selling him or her the practice. This is part of a business transaction. They are paying fair market value for the practice. And while you believe that this is the greatest practice in the world, or maybe you believe that, at the end of the day, there is a value and a business piece to it. I've spoken with business owners who will tell me, well, I'll sell my business if somebody wants to pay me $1 million for it. Well, it's not worth $1 million, right? Nobody's going to come in and pay you $1 million for a business that isn't worth $1 million. And so just being realistic about what you've got here is essential to making this conversation work. Now, as I said before, right, you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't take all the cash flow and then sell. So one of the things you've got to think about is making things at fair market value. So for example, your salary should be a fair market value salary based on production and management and maybe the training efforts that you put in. That salary, on the other hand, shouldn't be too low and it shouldn't be too high. Oftentimes I'll see business owners make their salaries extremely low because they want to be able to get distributions. Distributions are taxed in a more favorable fashion than W-2 compensation. And so they do a little bit of shifting to make that happen, right? And again, as I said, the discretionary expenses, the benefits that the firm provides you may have to be adjusted. And it's important to approach this conversation from the associate's viewpoint, right? So most associates have never owned a business before. They have no view into the internal operations and probably don't understand law firm economics. To them, your firm looks like a massive risk because what we'll be talking about, if you've got a successful firm, are big numbers for them, right? And so they've never purchased something like this, or maybe if they did, it was their house. And so instantly what they're thinking about is my income is going to go down because I've got to make these payments. Plus, they're going to see massive risk here, right? They're going to see big numbers and they're not going to know how to go about paying for it. Okay, so in addition to the massive risk that they see around the big numbers and that question, how the heck am I going to pay for this thing? They're going to wonder, okay, well, if the current donor, you, retires or, passes away or becomes disabled, what happens? How do I know this thing is going to continue? And there's always this little suspicion in the background of, is the owner trying to unload a lemon on me? Am I getting the right deal? How do I know that I'm not being taken advantage of? There's always this concern, right? And so it's important to take these into account and then also to take into account the life issues that the buyer is looking at, right? Because depending on their age, they might be buying a house, they might be getting married, they might be looking at having children. In various different stages, they're not ready to go ahead and consider owning your firm. So you've got to look for somebody who is at the right stage. And we found that the sweet spot for buyers is typically the 37 to the 52 age range, right? At about 37, maybe 40, they're ready for the next step. They've typically bought the house, they got married, and maybe they have a child or maybe have a couple of children or that kind of thing, but they're ready to go and take the next step. And I find, frankly, from a standpoint of having children, that can be either a huge positive or a huge negative. It's a huge positive if all of a sudden the associate feels like, oh my gosh, I've got these little humans that I have to take care of and I've got all this responsibility on me, and then they step up and take that responsibility. The other hand, it could be, well, I want to spend more time with the kids. I'm not looking to be a business owner. And so that's something certainly to evaluate. And these are all done before we start the conversation, right? So it's getting your mind in the right place and understanding the lay of the land from the associate's viewpoint. So let's get to the conversation. As we start the conversation, one thing I want to recommend to you is a book that I think is really helpful on this, and that's called Crucial Conversations. And it talks about making a safe space for communications. This really is a conversation where you've got to have a free flow of information. At the initial stages, we're providing information, but we need to allow the associate to digest that information and then get back to us. It's also helpful to know the associate's personality. Now, we use the DISC profile to give us an idea of how the associate approaches the world. And by doing that, we're able to understand what's going to come up for them in this conversation. It really makes the conversation more powerful because we can predict in many instances where the associate is going to go in terms of that conversation and how we can address their needs by virtue of that. Now, remember, we can't force this upon the associate, because if we do that without a real commitment, then the transaction is not going to happen. One way or the other, the associate is not going to follow through with the transaction. And in some instances, as I said before, they've left. We had a situation where we were setting this up for a firm with multiple buyers, and one of the buyers in particular was not on board. He had a really interesting view. He thought that the seller should just give him the practice at the end. And when he didn't do that and included others as part of the transaction, he felt slighted and left the practice. Now, I'm not sure that there was much that could be done there, because there was never going to be an instance where one person was getting the firm when there was a number of associates who certainly had put the time and grade. But it does give you an idea about some of the ramifications that can happen if this is handled properly. Now, remember too, that as we get into this, there's a lot here. It's a lot to digest, and it's a lot for the associate to digest. When we handle this conversation, and this is an essential part of what we do when we work with firms, we want to make sure that we set the right environment and that we let the associate know upfront, why are we doing this? What is the purpose of the conversation? We go through the process in detail and make sure they understand this is a discussion. It's not a mandate, not a one-way presentation. It's meant to be a free flow of ideas. So they should feel free to ask questions. And this, frankly, is the best signal that they're engaged, is them continuing to ask questions, right? And I think you've got to make them at ease. You want them to understand the arrangement completely and raise any and all issues, but that's the environment. Sometimes, depending on the relationship between the owner and the associates, that can be a little bit stilted, and sometimes we go back alone without the owner in the conversation to understand where the associate is. Now, just one thing I want to tell you, if the associate is represented by counsel, obviously we don't do it without their counsel there, but nonetheless, there can be a benefit in having that conversation without the seller, so that we can make sure that if there's any issues between the seller and the buyer, that those are taken out of the conversation. Okay, so as I said, we first start identifying the overall purpose. Really important questions to answer in this are, why is the seller thinking of this now? And then what is the benefit for the associate buyer? For those of you that worried about the introduction, there's a lot of people who are business owners who always worry about, what if my employees find out that I'm thinking of leaving, thinking of retiring? What's going to happen to my business? Well, I have news for you. They are already thinking about that. They want to know that their job is safe. And so this conversation can really help the morale, both from the associate perspective, but also from the other team members' perspective, because it shows that you are making a plan for the future. And so the really important part of the conversation is to explain that why are you thinking of this now? You're thinking of a plan for the future. You want the firm to continue on. You want to make sure that clients are taken care of, that staff is taken care of, all of that. So ultimately, what is the benefit for the associate owner? Well, of course, it's becoming an owner. There's profit there, right? If all you do is make what you would have made working for somebody else, you should go work for somebody else. Because at the end of the day, the reason to take on the risk of being an owner of a firm is for the profitability of that firm. And there are times when profitability goes up and down, but at the end of the day, that is the benefit, right? And so when talking about this, as I said before, the associate can come up with an issue of, oh my gosh, what happened? When are you leaving, right? I'm not ready. And so it's important to begin this process early. I've said that before in many of these episodes, but it's also important to lay it out for the associate. So it's, not now, maybe 7 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, explaining to them the length of time that you're going to, number one, be there to transition client relationships, to help out with the technical aspects of the practice of law, but also to train them to be a good owner. And then sometimes we'll do a multi-step so that it allows the owner to continue to work full-time for, some period of time, let's just call it 5 years, and then ultimately to move to part-time where they'd be out in, 7 or 10 years total. So we have a transition of the firm, not a complete one-day handover of the firm. So I think it's important to restate that the compensation plan must be in order. It must be at fair market value for any transition to actually really be successful. And so if you have any questions about that, just drop me an email. I'm happy to answer them. But at the end of the day, that is one piece, because we had a situation where we were talking with an associate and there was some hesitation during this conversation. And so we circled back around, and it turns out that the associate felt they weren't being compensated adequately. Did a little bit of digging and realized, that actually is an accurate feeling. And so we were able to adjust the compensation plan, and then the associate was back on board. So really taking a look at that compensation plan before you get into the conversation is going to be important. And now you may have an appropriate compensation plan and the associate believes they're not being compensated. And then in that case, we've got a different discussion about market compensation and then the ways that the associate can bring up firm profitability and thereby get a portion of that. The next step in the conversation is to discuss the arrangements at a 35,000 foot level. So kind of generally how it would work with the initial buy-in. And then either the ultimate buy-in, or if we're going to do a 3-step process, the second stage. For the initial step, remember to let them know that the profits are going to pay the purchase price, and that you're essentially bringing them in as a new partner in the firm. So for lawyers, being a partner is an important thing, many lawyers anyway. This is part of the conversation before this to make sure that you understand why the buyer is doing this. Sometimes associates just want to be identified as a partner, so it makes them easier to go out into the world and hold themselves out that way. And in that case, that's a different transaction than we're talking about today. But if they truly want to be a partner, this is getting them to be a partner. Now, as a general rule, we want the first step to be a 10% interest. The SBA lending guidelines will allow a partner to secure a buyout loan that's SBA guaranteed if they own a 10% interest in the firm. They can use that 10% interest as their equity infusion to buy the firm. And so essentially, you're going to be able to do a buyout loan with that associate through a bank lending that's SBA guaranteed. Now, I think a couple things to remember here. That would be a situation where, you became disabled or, God forbid, you died and there was no insurance. This would allow the associate to get a loan and make that loan long enough in term that, it ultimately allowed him or her to get the profits of the firm and also pay it over a period of time. Your heirs would get a lump sum, and then ultimately the associate gets to pay it out over a period of time. But in this initial step, we can't have any bank financing, so we're going to do the internal financing. It means you're going to hold a promissory note. we're going to set that promissory note up so that it's non-recourse and a pledge of equity, right? So the idea being that you go ahead and you buy, you're going to pay this off with the profits that come out of the firm, net of taxes, of course. And then if you don't pay or something goes wrong, then the shares of stock or the membership interest in your firm goes back to you as the owner. And then we enter a co-owner agreement that protects against the transaction going bad and includes the future steps. So, if we're going to do a 3-step, it includes all of the future 2 steps that have to be done. And then it doesn't prevent you from selling as long as your partner, your new partner, gets his or her percentage of the sale price. So again, the initial step being we get them in, we get them treated as a partner, we describe to them what all these documents do and why we have them. Once that's digested, we want to get into the numbers. Now, we prepare a model of what the transaction looks like. And so you should lay out the numbers in significant detail. Why are you coming up with the price? How did you come up with the practice price? What does the cash flow of the firm look like? How will the payments be made from the cash flow of the firm? How does this all work? So it's laying out the numbers and showing them this is how it works, right? So obviously you need to know where you're at now, what we call the reality check, which sets the practice value, understands what the cash flow is, and then develop those transaction terms. Walking through the numbers on a video call is usually what we do. If you're sitting next to the associate, it's really taking that spreadsheet and walking through it step by step. There can be a tendency to get into the weeds pretty far. So I would keep things at a high level unless there are specific questions. The key is here, look for signs of engagement or disengagement. That will lead you to the point of inquiring and trying to figure out what's going on here. Is there no interest? Is there some disagreement? Really being attuned to the nonverbal communication that you're getting from the associate. And then finally, you'd wrap up, ask questions, maybe give the associate some resources, and then ultimately talk about the next steps and set up the next steps at that wrap-up conversation. We want to keep the ball rolling. If we don't set those next steps, there's a tendency to let this go on for an extended period of time. I think that ultimately we need to have a bit of a cooling off period so that the associate can digest this. I wouldn't let it go, more than 2 weeks. And I would say a week would be enough, depending on what's going on, maybe a week and a half. And then ultimately make sure that everything is in order for the associate. Now, once that's done, we would go to a written document that laid out what the deal terms were so that they would have it in writing and could compare it to the documents that are ultimately prepared. Well, that is it for the conversation. I hope you found this useful. Ultimately, this is a make or break conversation for your exit plan, so it's really important that you get it right. If you have any questions about this, please give me a call. I'm happy to help you walk you through it. And remember, if you like this, please subscribe and give us a like on any of the platforms. I would very much appreciate a 5-star review. Thanks. Look forward to talking to you soon. Bye.